Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Designing a Mobile Device Lab with our guest, Costa Avradopoulos. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our company and today's house rules. This webinar is presented by XBOSoft. We're a software testing and quality assurance consulting company. We've been around since 2006. We help clients improve the quality of their software in various industries from health to finance, and we have offices in San Francisco, Beijing, and the Netherlands. And we will move on to our house rules for today. Everyone aside from our speakers today is in listen-only mode. We're going to encourage you to post your questions in the panel to the right of your screen, and we will try to field them throughout the webinar as well as at the end, depending on time. You can also post your questions on Twitter, so feel free to post them at XBOSoft and using today's hashtag handle, hashtag mobile device lab. We will try to field those as well, and those we don't get to, we'll direct message or answer in our blog. Now, this webinar will be recorded, and you'll receive an email following the webinar with that information. To introduce you to our participants and speakers today, first we have Phil Lew, CEO of XBOSoft, and myself on the right of the slide, Carla Smith. I send out emails for the webinar and handle our marketing here at XBOSoft. Now I'll pass you on to Phil, who will introduce you to our guest speaker. Phil?
Hey, Carla, thanks. Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and it's great to welcome our guest presenter, Costa. Costa has, a wealth of experience, and I guess he's revealing his age a little bit. 25 years of experience. You started when you were 28 years old, Costa?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. So as you can see from his profile here, I won't read it out loud, but he's got quite a bit of experience and is one of the leading experts in mobile testing strategies. He's now a principal for Avricom, which also is a company that focuses on mobile strategies. So we're really pleased to have Costa here. Costa, why don't you go ahead and take it from here and talk about why we're here and go forward in your agenda.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the introduction, Phil. Very excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is how to build a better device lab, or how to build one from scratch if you're just getting started. So, mobile applications, right? We know that growth is explosive right now. A lot of disruption in the market, which I absolutely love. But there's also disruption in the what I call the software factory, right? We see a lot of people trying to find the silver bullet with testing. What's the best tool? What's the best practice or the best approach? Well, the best practice for me is, of course, not going to be the best practice for anyone else. So we need to go through a process or a methodology, just like we do with anything else in software. And that's what I really love. Of course, mobile does require a little bit different approach. I do make the analogy a lot of times back to the early days of web, right? The 25 years ago, back when I was 28. How did we deal with those testing challenges? A lot of the analogy is we're dealing with a lot of the mobile testing challenges in the same way, in how we're trying to deal with those specific nuances that mobility challenges us with. So again, as I said, a good strategy does start with designing a mobile device lab, and that's usually where I start with a lot of clients. Is just trying to understand what should my lab look like, right? One of the top questions I get from clients is, what should I be testing? Am I testing enough? Am I over testing? Do I have too many devices? And of course, with thousands of variations out there, it's really just insufficient to think that you're going to use the same old methods that you've been using for desktop web testing.
Yeah, a lot of our clients, Costa, continuously ask us what would be the top 10 devices that we should test. So hopefully we'll be able to get around that question today.
Absolutely. So just a quick glance at our agenda. We're going to start with mobile testing challenges. Some you may have heard of, some you may have not. I like to cover these because they will help us in determining and shaping what our lab requirements look like. So if we have a clear understanding of most, I won't say all, but most of our testing challenges, then we'll be able to better define those requirements with that and not have, oh, we implemented it this way, but we didn't think about these three gotchas at some point. So it's good to have a clear understanding of some potential gotchas anyway. Then of course, we'll dive into how do we define our lab requirements. We'll wrap that up with an exercise with some sample data. And then we'll go over what a device lab actually looks like and some of the components and talk about some of those. Out of scope for today is we're not going to get into discussion or deep dive on pros and cons of one tool versus tool A versus tool B and so on and so forth, or anything regarding automation. That would be an entire presentation just by itself to cover all of these things. So for the sake of time, we will maybe have that for a future presentation.
Okay, great.
So I like to start with at the highest level, how do we define mobile? And really what we're trying to do here is just be consistent. That's the key message here. I've seen some clients that actually include laptops in their mobility definitions, which is perfectly fine. Other companies choose to exclude tablets. So they put tablets over in the desktop or in the non-mobile part of their testing, and they have a different strategy or framework for those types of devices, and that's fine as well. Again, the key here is be consistent, whatever you choose, and just be aware that the framework or the strategy you put in place today, it needs to be flexible enough to cover new technologies such as connected cars, connected refrigerators, wearables, and so on and so forth. So the other thing I like to talk about is Windows 8. So Windows 8 is interesting, and even Windows 10 now. You have that seamless experience across so many different form factors. So which is it, right? So going back to the question of the laptop versus the tablet, Windows 8 could be on a phone, it could be on a tablet, or it could be on a laptop. So again, think of that's a good example of when you're thinking about how to define mobility. That's a good way to go about doing it.
Well, that gets to all of the millions or thousands of permutations that you could have in your device lab, I guess. I mean, just
Indeed.
Yeah.
So for those unfamiliar with the World Quality Report, it is a one-of-a-kind report that I enjoy looking at every year. It's a very thick report. It's highly coveted. It comes out every October. And we have some third-party firms that interview thousands of executives from around the world. Could be a quality manager, could be a CIO, and basically we try to understand where their current challenges, where they think they will be making investments, and most importantly as well, where are they putting their focus and their budgets. So quality trends are analyzed, year-over-year results, so on and so forth. And the interesting thing to point out is that this huge report actually has a dedicated section to mobile. So if we can move to the next slide. And so again, these are just some continued key findings. And as I mentioned, mobile has its own section. So obviously stressing the importance of mobility. If you do want to get a copy of this report, please feel free to send me an email to the address there on your screen.
What do you think, Costa, about the relationship between mobile and agile?
Interesting, yes. So definitely the growth coincides with a lot of smaller teams putting mobile applications out there. There's definitely a lot of synergy there between
Right.
agile and mobile.
Well, here's a big one.
So this is just one snapshot of this out of the World Quality Report that shows um, where are people focused in terms of the different aspects of testing. So security over the years, you can see the trend from 2012 to 14, and basically what we see here is an increased focus in functional usability and compatibility. And although performance does show a continued increase, it's still in the top three. Sorry, decrease. It still is in the top three.
Hmm.
So the key here that we want to think about is how will our device lab support these different types of tests um, on the area focus. That's the main. So we're really in a sad state of affair here with over 2.6 million applications. 65% have a 1 star. That's about 1.7 million applications for iOS and Android combined. Um, so it seems many companies are eager to get to market first, but they just don't have the right test strategy. And that starts with having a proper device lab. So um, surprisingly, many companies don't have any testing at all, about 1/3. They just develop and deploy. So no surprise that the statistics show. Of course, we have some examples there of the impacts um, of improper testing or
Yeah.
strategy.
So, I mean, a lot of companies that are developing for mobile apps and they have an agile team together. And of course, the mantra of agile is working software, and they throw something out there um, for their users, and they end up getting 1 star. I mean, how does that really impacts the future of their not only their application but their whole company, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Where do you draw the line?
Right. And so now you have a lot of these companies that are really focused on, okay, where did we go wrong? And let's scramble to try to either um, save face and move the needle, right? So a lot of companies uh, approach me and others as well on how do I move the needle just to get to three from 1 star to 3 stars.
Yeah.
Um, well, again, it starts with what are you doing today? And a lot of companies aren't doing any testing at all, let alone having a device lab. So,
Right.
so
Right.
a lot of that is being revisited. And
Uh,
again, a lot of this, I mentioned it earlier, I make the analogy back to when web, right? When the internet and web first came around, a lot of this we were still trying to figure out. It seems like you would think we would be a little more mature about it, having had the lessons learned of web, but there are enough differences um, with mobile that command respecting those nuances and coming up with a different approach.
yeah.
So again, the impact of failure is that it's much greater because we have that higher visibility. Uh, Again, we really understand what failure means in traditional desktop web. We get that. Again, mobility just adds more complexity, more risk, and of course everything is accelerated. So we absolutely cannot afford a misstep here in mobility. One small misstep is a cascading effect, and never before have we really had have consumers had such a strong voice. It really enables them to cut through the hype and ultimately report on true quality of a product, both good and bad, right?
Right.
And now we have close to approaching 3 million applications just for Android and iOS. Consumers are much less tolerant of issues, and they're very quick to switch. So because they have 3 million apps to choose from, right? Not only that, but the barriers have become lower, right? Near zero switching costs. It's much easier for customers to make those switches.
Hmm. Less than half returning if you have a slow app. That's pretty low. The
Yeah,
stakes are pretty high there.
indeed. So now into some of the key testing challenges that we have for mobility. Security is at the top, and given the frequency of companies we've seen in the news for security breaches, that's no surprise that we see that there. But security is also important when we're designing our device lab, right? So we want to ensure the highest integrity of testing and all the components when we're building our lab. Usability and performance are also top. These are top drivers in App Store ratings. So absolutely want to make sure these are part of your test strategy and considerations when you're building your device lab. Network testing is something I see often that's often overlooked, especially with the do-it-yourself labs. So do-it-yourself labs, what I mean by that is I walk in and I have maybe an iPad and a couple of Android tablets, a couple of iPhones, a couple of Android phones, just sitting on a tester's desk, or I have them spread out over various testers' desks, and they're all plugged into USB chargers, and they're all strewn everywhere, and you have so that's what I mean by a do-it-yourself lab. So which is common in a lot of companies. So network testing is often overlooked, and so consumers, and they have, but the point there is they're using Wi-Fi to connect. 9 times out of 10, they're connecting these devices to Wi-Fi. Your consumers are not using Wi-Fi most of the time. So again, why would you test that way? You need to consider that when you're building your lab. Of course, the challenge with do-it-yourself labs is finding a space to physically store these, and also that has an area with good cellular reception. Going back to the storage question, so you have the physical security of the devices. So many times I've seen in do-it-yourself labs where devices get legs and they just disappear. They get loaned out to a developer and never to be seen again, or just all kinds of crazy stories there. So again, think about the physical security aspect there as well. Fragmentation, this really is often underestimated, and again, it's the most common cause of that is you're not using proper data to define your coverage, or you may have a very limited budget, and it's just not, it's really an afterthought. So Android has really accelerated the fragmentation, and it's no end in sight there for that. Of course, tools, we need to make sure we're trained properly and that we leverage other people that have expertise in various tools. And the last one is lack of awareness. So here, what I'm mentioning, the point here is that we want to set expectations properly and be very flexible, because mobile testing is still very greenfield. Again, making the analogy of where web testing was in 1990, that's kind of where we're at with mobile. So the point here is be open to collaborating with others outside of your company, not just within your company, but others that have gone further with this, and also be open to custom solutions, whether they're in-house or you're partnering with other tool vendors to create these solutions, and also with service providers as well.
Yeah, I think just wanted to note here with reference to the networks that you don't have 4G LTE on here, and I know that AT&T is reallocating a lot of their 4G spectrum for LTE. So when you're traveling around and you have 4G, there's a big difference between 4G and LTE. And it's just amazing, the effects of them reallocating that spectrum. You just get such low performance on 4G, so that definitely needs to be tested.
Absolutely, great point. Okay, so what do we mean exactly by these? We throw around the term cloud, and again, this excludes the do-it-yourself lab. But outside of that, we're either going to have an external cloud or an internal cloud. Basically, these are the top choices. And so what we mean is Really, external is just simply outside your firewall. So we're using a provider that will host the devices for you. And of course, you have a choice whether those devices are in a public area, which is shared with other clients, could be competitors in that device pool as well. And you have a private cloud again, which is dedicated only to your company. So that's external. Internal simply means that you're hosting the devices behind your firewall. It could be in your facility where you're located, in the city, in the building that you physically work in, or it could be a building in multiple facilities around the world. So um, the key here is that all devices are accessed via remote control methods. So think, for those familiar with using remote desktop and virtual machines, you would access these devices, these real devices, in the same way. So let's talk about, before we get into the pros and cons of external versus internal, let's talk about some of the advantages that they both share. And really, these are advantages over the do-it-yourself lab. So really, we talk about the collaboration that's there. There are things you can do with both of these clouds, like sharing video, taking video to recreate a defect, taking screenshots and incorporating that into your defect tracking tools. And you can do device logging. So that is all very helpful in when you're deploying these applications. You also have the ability to do much better device management. So rather than losing devices and, hey, where's that iPad? I need to do some testing, and spending a half an hour trying to hunt it down. These devices are under lock and key, whether it's internal or external. They're managed by, we have one person that owns the physical management of those devices, as well as the provisioning and maintenance. So provisioning, we mean if we have to deploy an iOS update to those, and who's tracking which devices have which versions of operating system, as well as just general maintenance. What if a device freezes for whatever reason? A tester's in the middle of doing something, got a critical release coming out. So the concept of having a lab manager becomes critical in trying to make sure maybe that device needs a factory reset to get it back online again.
Right. So besides that, are there certain types of tests that can be done or cannot be done depending on the type of lab that you have?
That is a great question, actually. And what we've seen is it's quite exciting. The evolution of how a lot of these commercial tools, it's just unbelievable how great some of those scenarios. For example, I'll give you one. Being able to test landscape, when you're holding your phone and you turn it, portrait versus landscape, the application typically will flip to match whichever direction you're flipping the phone. So the ability to do that remotely, whether the device is sitting in a cart on premise or it's sitting in a data center externally. How do you do that? Because do you put a robot there, a hand to flip the device mechanically? So we've artificially have created a method, within the last year or so to do that. So a lot of the tools now support being able to flip it without physically flipping the phone. So things like that really take away from, it used to be the argument for do-it-yourself labs was, well, we can't flip the portrait to landscape, we can't make a phone call, or we can't do right, and the list was quite long. But fortunately, a lot of the solutions out there have addressed most of those scenarios now to where it's a non-issue.
Yeah, well, I guess these public type solutions, they cost quite a bit of money, don't they? How about costs? How does that fall into this kind of consideration?
That's a great question as well. So surprisingly, these neither. Well, I'll say this. So neither of these, neither internal or external, are cheap. They're a little more expensive than you might estimate, especially if you're coming in for the first time doing these. So they're a little pricey, and you would think there would be a little more cost effective. But really, the key here is it stresses the importance of two things that you need to focus on. One is you really need to use ROI tools that can help you leverage and maximize your investment. And the other point is really defining proper test coverage, which we have a whole section coming up here that we're going to talk about. It really stresses the importance of really understanding how many devices. I walk into some clients and I say, show me your device lab, and they'll show me one Android device and one iPhone, and that's the lab. So obviously, in most cases, that's not going to be enough. So what is enough, right? What should I be testing on? And that's kind of what we'll dive deeper on coming up. So some of the pros and cons of an external cloud, and we have some pictures here of what these devices look like in a data center. You have on the bottom kind of a device rack with devices hardwired into an administration hub, and in the upper right is another tool from another solution from Perfecto Mobile that has a similar type of approach with, again, thousands of devices all over the globe that you can access remotely. They're in data centers. So some of the advantages, obviously, scalability is top of mind. You can access, you have access to many devices that really, some are no longer being manufactured. So if you need to, your CEO is really pushing you to make sure you have support for this old BlackBerry that was created, 8 years ago, you can most likely get it from one of these public cloud providers. Whereas if you're wanting to do this on your own, whether it's do it yourself or internal, good luck trying to find that device somewhere. Maybe you might get lucky on eBay, but not likely. So the other key here is that you don't have to worry about device maintenance, and really this is a component that's underestimated. When you're doing it yourself, there's a lot of maintenance that goes on here, and it really is a full-time job. So it's nice to have someone else doing it for you, in terms of these providers. Of course, newer devices is another component. So these are added constantly, and they're at no additional cost. So these solution providers have partnerships with the manufacturers, Samsung, Apple, and in many cases they get the devices before the public gets them. So you could be in there testing, the new Samsung Galaxy S7, a couple of months before anyone else has access to it. So you can see what your app does on some of these devices. Whereas if you're on your own, you're not going to be. Most companies are not going to have relationships with Samsung or other manufacturers, unless, of course, you're a carrier. So, in fact, talking about carriers, all of the major carriers use one or more of these public cloud providers before deploying their new devices to their network. So, Verizon, AT&T, so on. So, it's another advantage there. And when I talk about flexible, so it enables you to have more advanced custom solutions. And the one scenario or the one example is around GPS. So if I want to have location aware, an application that says I want to launch my application. Let's say I have a restaurant finder application, but I want to test my restaurant finder app in London or somewhere else in the world. Obviously, I'm not flying to London to go do this test. So these solutions have some really creative ways of emulating that and making that happen within the data center. Whereas if you're doing it on an on-premise or a do-it-yourself lab, you're not going to be able to do that. So some of the disadvantages, you know, what we mean by performance tends to be slower is we're talking about the tester user experience. So I'm a tester. I'm accessing this a device via my browser, and I click on, let's say maybe I'm watching a video within my app. I'm testing to make sure video play. If I'm scrolling through, that may be one component. If I'm scrolling within the application, I may see a little bit of lag there because of the network, the latency. So I'll click on scroll, maybe hesitate a second or two before I see the screen scroll up. So that's one aspect. And another one is anything that's bandwidth intensive, like a video itself, may also show a little bit of lag. So the tools are constantly working to minimize these and improve that experience. Of course, cloud really, when we talk about security, it's really no more of a concern. I know this one gets beat to death, but it's really no more of a concern for non-mobile clouds as it is for mobile. So if you're doing other non-mobile cloud stuff, this is really a non-issue for you in most cases. And again, the adoption rate for cloud, I think I saw a statistic the other day is around 60 to 70% adoption. This is companies that are using any form, even if it's partial cloud. Again, not just mobile, but any type of cloud. So it's pretty high. Another concern for many is sharing data. So if if you're using production data to seed your application, maybe one of your competitors is using that public cloud and the device didn't get wiped, and they might have access to some of your production data. So again, some of these solutions are constantly being addressed.
Right. I'd like to go back to that performance. We were trying to use one of these public cloud services, and we found the performance, not just with video, but just for installing an app and getting it going, was just prohibitive. And I guess things have improved since about a year ago, but that would
They
be a major concern for us anyway. It's just too slow.
Indeed, yes, and they're certainly aware of these. It's a top issue for all of the external cloud providers,
Uh-huh.
and it has improved
Yeah.
significantly. The key is, work with your provider, and
Hmm.
obviously, if if all your troubleshooting is exhausted, then maybe consider another
Yeah. Now,
provider.
when you use their services, are you able to, I guess you could say, clean the phone and have it just back to a generic configuration with no other apps installed before you install yours?
Exactly, absolutely. Yeah, and some have actually automated that process as
Right,
well. So.
right.
Okay, so on-premise. This is what we call, some call it on-premise, some call it internal cloud. So basically, there are two types of on-premise clouds. We talked about the do-it-yourself lab. There are also commercial tools that provide you with some type of hub, or others even have a cart where you can physically store the devices and also put them under lock and key. So again, it does provide, that physical security to make sure devices don't walk off, and as well as control over your test data. So that's kind of that second bullet there, increased security. Um, and going back to what we were just discussing with performance, so you have a much better user experience for the tester, and in most cases, you don't experience some of those issues with lag and anytime you're wanting to test video. So if you're a media company or testing those kind of high bandwidth applications, you might lean this way for those types of tests. Um, and the other component that is common as well, which a lot of the do-it-yourself lab folks really miss by going public, or want to think about, is you have access to pull those devices. So let's say that QA manager says, I need to physically touch the device because I want to do maybe I want to do some NFC testing. I want to test making a payment with Apple Pay. And I can't really do that in the cart, and I can't really do that in external cloud. So I really need to grab the device and see what that looks like. with this particular. So maybe I want to do some exploratory testing. It's great to be able to have that cart. So what that would look like is you would go. I'm a tester. I would go to the lab manager or the owner of that cart or wherever the devices may be stored. They might be in a closet somewhere with other servers. And I would check out that device through a checkout process to say, and that way you know where that device is, right? So that's the beauty of being able to do that. Some of the disadvantages with on-premise is obviously scalability is going to be very limited. So if I have 25 devices, I'm okay. But what if I need 100, or what if I need 200? That becomes more than just one lab manager. It becomes, now I have to hire additional resources, and then where do I physically put these? Do I need more space? It can become quite complex. So if your test coverage demands 500 or more devices, this becomes kind of mission impossible, if you will. So the other con is, again, you have to, like we talked about it, you have to hire resources, right, as opposed to letting the provider do it in the external cloud. The other challenge is procuring devices. So 30% of devices become obsolete every 3 months. So you're constantly having to retire devices if your strategy requires it, and then it's difficult to get access to new devices, right? But we mentioned the external providers have access to the new, for example, the iPhone 6s and 6s Plus before they were available. Same thing with any of the other manufacturers. So you're not going to, in most cases, unless you're a carrier, you're not going to have that kind of access. And so, of course, do-it-yourselfs. We already talked about that. Okay. So just another perspective here, and a comparison. We talk so much about physical devices, and I have another slide. I think it's actually in the next slide, but we talk about the importance of physical devices, and emulators for the most part shy away from, but they do have their place. We don't want to say don't ever use emulators. They can be very cost effective. You can just install one and fire it up right away and start using it. They can be helpful for if you're a UX person or you wanted to look at layout, or if you're a developer wanting to do some unit testing, they can certainly help you in those regards. But you can't, they're very limited in that you can't make phone calls or send a text message or do interruption testing and so many other things. And we've seen, historically, have seen many severity 1 type defects leak out into production when this was your only method of testing early on. We've seen a lot of those issues out there. So that's what's been the big movement to real devices.
Mm-hmm. So, Costa, we have emulators here, we have physical devices in a lab, and I guess there's kind of like one step missing here. So there would be physical devices, like you said, when you walk into a client and they have a couple of phones sitting there on desks, and then you have a private cloud, and then you have the public cloud. And I'm wondering to myself, when do you make the jump from one step to the next? You kind of understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely, yes. So that's a great point. Again, it stresses the importance of really understanding what should my coverage look like. So many times, and again, just like the customer with one iPhone and one Android device, the first step is really trying to understand, where is my gap? What should I be testing? And I get this a lot is, do I have enough devices, or do I have too many devices? And once you understand, let's say you do the analysis, and after your analysis says your device lab should have 37 devices in it, and you only have 7. So the first step is, driving that that discussion, and then once you decide that, that will help determine whether you're going on premise.
Yeah.
Um,
I think also that there's a place to think about having a combination of these things that you do. But
Indeed.
I'll just let you go on and talk about the lab requirements, though.
Okay, wonderful. Um, yeah, absolutely. We'll get into a lot of those. So with lab requirements, so the first step, we talked about this before, emulators are tempting to use because they have low cost. Now, let's take a step back and clarify what we mean by test integrity. So we've been doing, this is nothing new, right? We've been doing this for years. It's really the degree, how close we match production. And I've seen companies really take this to the nth degree with down to the level of firmware that's installed on a router or a switch, within their network to match, hardware components in production with their QA environment. So you can go pretty far with this, but basically the point here is that it becomes mobile is much more sensitive to these issues, to these variations. So you need to be much more careful when you're defining when you're designing your lab. So again, we talked about Sev1 defects that have leaked into production relying strictly on emulators, and the thing here is the main challenge is that real devices really pose a headache for us when we're designing a lab, which we've already talked about, right? Whether it's hiring a lab manager or where do we put these things, or the security or the performance. Since we're saying real is the way to go, and we really have no way to properly virtualize a mobile device yet, I say, on a desktop, we have these options. Again, the maturity is not there yet. So this is what we're left with. I'll really quickly go through these so we have time to go through our exercise. So some other considerations, the most important thing here is the test objective. If nothing else, remember that. So how wide or how deep are you going to go with your testing? Are you going to do performance testing? Are you going to do usability testing? And then how deep are you going to go with each of those tests? Are you going to do just some exploratory usability, or are you going to have a full-on usability, UAT, and whatnot? And then obviously be very clear on your requirements. So I teach a workshop called Quality by Design for mobile. And so what that is it covers all of those not edge case, but all of the nuances and scenarios that a BA or even a QA analyst maybe doesn't think about. For example, what is your app supposed to do when it's interrupted with a phone call? And hundreds of other scenarios across 20 some odd categories. So again, that's a whole area, and it's really important to plan for those, because that's going to set up your test case design and make sure that you have very clear requirements. So everything else is really standard in terms of how you would approach non-mobile. So again, whether you want to automate versus manual, again, there's a lot of analysis out there. And of course, security we've already covered, and whatnot. Budget, obviously. So really quick, let's do a poll. How many models, and this is a fun one I like to do, and let's think about, again, I have some assumptions listed there because I get these whenever I do this poll. People always ask these questions. So the same device with the same model number on a different carrier is a different model. And that's because the carriers modify the operating system. They have the ability and the right to do that. So we've seen issues with applications where if you deploy it on with same device, two different carriers, where a defect will show up in one but not the other. So for those of you that actually want to try and do the math, like Phil, think about all the different carriers that we have first. Then think about all the different versions of each operating system that you might want to test, or actually not that you want to test, but that are out there, right? Going back to iOS 4, if there's some people still using iOS 4, iOS 5,
I think it.
5.01,
I think.
5.02.
Yeah, I think a lot of people may think that these numbers are really high, but when you multiply the permutations, when you have different operating systems and different devices and different networks that they're going to be tested on, I mean, the permutations can multiply very, very quickly.
Indeed. And then screen sizes too,
Oh yeah.
right? So we have screen sizes are a big one as well that really make that number grow as well.
I mean, it looks like everybody is just about voted, and we got 1/3 at 15,000, 1/3 at 20,000, and 1/3 at 35,000.
Okay.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a lot of permutations out there. So we had 1/3, 20,000 different variations. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So generally, most people were right around there, either just below or just above.
Hmm.
Um, and this is as of today, right? We have new devices being uh, deployed all the time. So this number, and it's just a matter of, and then we have some that are being retired, where no longer in use, or the percentage of market share becomes so low it's irrelevant to testing. But the main thing here is, again, when you ask the question, how do I know what to test? And we have these. It's really the ultimate QA manager's nightmare, right? Compared to web testing 25 years ago, we've just it's mind-numbing, some of where we start. So even if you're using 80/20, you're still left with thousands.
Yeah.
So how do we address this nightmare? Analytics, my friend. They are your new best friend. Becomes very and critically important. There are many tools in the market that help you make data-driven decisions. So there's a couple that are listed here. Again, the main thing here is these tools work the same as they do for desktop web. Not only will they tell you your platform that your users have, but they'll also tell you, which version of operating system, and also what they did within the application, how many times they tried to check out, how many items they added, abandoned carts and those kind of other things that product managers like to do. Um, but in many cases, the interesting thing here is for folks that want to avoid using these tools, they'll just use market data, right? Because market data is just Google it. You can find, okay, the US is using, here's the breakdown of Android versus iOS. In many cases, your user base for your company will not follow those market demographics. So it's very important to follow this so you understand what your users are using, not what the general average or what the US market holds. Most companies, I strongly suggest they do this, evaluate this once a month, and then make adjustments to your device lab accordingly. So pull out devices that are dropping, and then add emerging devices as they come up.
Hmm.
Once you've established those top percentages, then you can create tiers, which we'll go over during the lab exercise. Okay, so some other analytics around what your users are saying. So this is called sentiment analysis. This helps you benchmark yourself against the competition, helps you track and resolve issues that are found in production. So there's an example on the next slide. Applause is one of the tools out there that does this analysis. So if you have one or two App Store people reviewing your app in the App Store, if you have one or two reviews per day, it's easy for the QA manager to track and the product manager to track those. But what if you have thousands coming in? So what Applause does is it scans thousands of these reviews and other metadata, and it combines it, searching with custom algorithms and patterns, and it puts these into clusters so you can track trends. Are you trending up, trending down? Basically comes up with an Applause score based on a number of factors around usability, functionality, so on, performance, right, so on and so forth. And so, and it's rounding out, the how do we complete our test coverage picture. You can find all kinds of scenarios and hidden things by using not only tools like Applause, but also these other areas. So looking at message boards, what are people saying on Facebook? Again, we already mentioned app ratings and comments and reviews, but there are all these other things. And don't forget about your production tickets as well when those come in. Lots of hidden gems out there. So here we're going to jump into our lab definition exercise. And as we mentioned, your first step is always going to be review analytics. So if you don't have analytics, your first step is going to be go get them. There are a lot of tools out there. You can use a free trial to get started. It gives you your initial snapshot. If you're already using tools, then you'll know exactly what your data is in your breakdown. So here we have some sample data. Try to keep it very simple. So sample client has 55% iOS. There's the breakdown on devices, 43% Android and the devices as well, and then we have a small percentage on some other devices. So again, this is a little oversimplified, but some additional considerations: eight screen sizes in the top 80%, and we have 1,000 test cases.
I think what's interesting.
So keep in mind that, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think what's interesting is that based on the geography of your users also, you have to consider whether or not they have iOS or Android phones, because Android tends to be a bit cheaper than Apple phones, so that may impact what's available or what your users use.
Indeed, and we talk about Android, iOS, but in Europe, if you have a large portion of your user base in Europe, Windows Phone and BlackBerry is still quite popular. They're a much larger segment than 2%. I'll tell you that. So your strategy becomes much different, and that's why we say, again, use your analytics. Don't use market data, because it's gonna vary quite surprisingly. You'll be surprised how much it varies. And the important thing to note here is you will never be able to test all of it. So it really becomes important to come up with a tiered approach. And some may have seen this with risk-based testing. That applies here as well. And actually, risk-based testing works well with this because you can define, for example, tier 2, your mission-critical test cases that have the highest amount of risk, or maybe your areas of code that have that tend to break the most. That could be your tier 2 test cases. And again, I want to point out that for tier 1, while we're executing 100% of the tests, we're not executing 100% of the devices that are out there. So that's one thing to point out. It's not necessary to do that. So we've learned that 80% is a good general rule of thumb for your max, and that helps with some of that fragmentation, right? And at the bottom, of course, tier 4, we have some exploratory. So I like to show this. This was a method that one of the external cloud providers, Perfecto, came out with a few years back. They came up with a test coverage by phase, which I think is interesting. So again, it's just another perspective to think about. When you're in the development phase, you may only want to have 6 to 8 devices, and then you want to maybe think about adding 1 new device per quarter. So again, these are your absolute top critical devices. Notice up there you have, Sanity, testing, Agile, if you're doing continuous integration. And then again, if you're testing, you want to expand out a bit. Again, top critical devices, maybe doubling that to 12. And then production, you're at your max, maybe 30 to 40 devices. Again, this is just some sample data just to get you thinking about what number of devices by phase. On the next slide, so we have the latest framework that they have is test coverage by index, which I really like. And this index is put together by operating system coverage, screen sizes and resolutions, hardware coverage for different discrepancies in CPU, memory, and then device mix. So, which that reduces your risk of for emerging and popular favorites and reference devices. So the old 30, 50, 80. So 80 matches back to the tier 1. If we were comparing back to the previous slides, 80% becomes your tier 1, 50% tier 2, and then 30%. And you have some sample the numbers there: 10 to 16 devices, 17, 25, so on and so forth. So, and again, you were asking the question earlier, Phil, about at what point do I want to consider this? I think your answer is here. Anytime you're going over 10 devices, which is at the bottom of that, you want to start thinking about expanding your do-it-yourself lab or looking at other solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yet another view is test coverage by operating system. So again, applying that same breakdown, you're able to look at, okay, for a 30%, I only have, I'm only testing, these, 5 operating systems there. But for 50%, I'm testing everything in the 30% column plus everything in the 50% column. So again, it gets, this helps put some sanity around the, oh my gosh, what, I can't have 500 devices. So this helps put things in perspective. Same thing, followed with iOS below. And this requires constant, requires diligence to constantly update this, monitoring your analytics. Some companies do it on a weekly basis, and I've seen some larger companies do it on a daily basis. So they're quite sensitive to updating this.
Yeah, I can see how the permutations would increase very rapidly if you have 15 devices and you're multiplying by all these operating systems. Geez, that's a lot.
Exactly. All right, so rounding out, so now we're going to finish it up very quickly here. I don't have just have a few slides to talk about some common device lab components and what does this actually look like, right? So let's try to visualize, and let's start with the components first. Most, and what I want to point out here is that not all tools or every solution will have every single layer here. This is just what's possible, or everything that's available. So device management interface. Typically this is a browser, or it could be a thick client that's installed on your desktop. And it's a starting point where we see a list of devices that are available to us, whether we're a developer, product manager, tester, and then we can reserve those devices either real time or we can schedule them out. So I can say I need 2 iPads and an iPhone 6 on Friday from 2 to 5, and we can check those out, and when our time comes up, we'll get a reminder to go access those devices for our testing session. The next layer down is some type of device viewer. So again, I make the analogy back to virtual machines and desktops. This gives you a window into the actual device where you can control that device using your mouse and your keyboard in place of where your fingers may go on the screen. You can perform gestures, swipes, scrolls, text input, and so on. The next layer is remote control. So this again allows you to perform operating system level functions, and so this is an area that has really evolved from a technology standpoint. In the past, we used to require rooting or jailbreaking to get to enable us to control these devices, and that has matured to the point where that's no longer required, and we're using instrumentation now. So again, these are things to consider when you're comparing solutions out there and you're trying to build your lab. And so the last component is the device interface, the point that actually touches the devices. This could be a server that has devices hanging off of it via USB cables. It could be some kind of proprietary appliance that's connected some other way, but typically we're using USB connections. And of course, then you have the devices themselves. So one example of a freeware tool that some folks use is VNC, um, and that tool does not have that first layer device management at all. So you're just accessing. A lot of people use that for in do-it-yourself labs, and because it's free. So that's just one thing to point out there. So I think we have 2 more slides, and then we're done. I know we're just about out of time. So this is just a snapshot of what an on-premise cloud looks like. This is the end result. You have one thing to point out: both teams have access to all of the devices in each pool on both sides. So that's common, afterthought there. But again, everything is behind, is on site, regardless of what part of the world you're in. And of course, these devices can access Wi-Fi or carrier. Same thing with the public. Again, your devices can access carrier networks, but again, someone else is doing that for you, right? They're setting up the calling plans, and you don't have to worry about that extra expense of, oh, we need to make sure we have this, Verizon plan or AT&T for these various devices. And really, the key difference here is that the devices are stored and managed somewhere else. And of course, you have some minimal differences with firewall configurations.
It's interesting that you have an India test team and U.S. test team. Is a lot of companies split up duties between an offshore, either internal or external entity and themselves?
Indeed, yes, they do. It's quite common. So to wrap it up, just some key takeaways for you. Again, define mobile, whatever that is. Be detailed, be concise, and be consistent with how you in your definition, whatever it is you choose. But if you have to go have some meetings with your product manager and your business owner or whoever it is, make sure everyone's on the same page. So you don't say, "Oh, I thought tablets were excluded from this." Again, be consistent across your organization. Um, Make sure you have very clear, test objectives. And the main thing there is around test types. How deep will you go? How far will you go with usability? Um, Consider all the different factors that we talked about, right? Will you consider emulators as part of your strategy? What's your budget? Where's your team located? Um, and of course, decide. We say cloud versus on-premise, but really, and Phil, you touched on this earlier. A lot of people are, as this evolves, are moving towards both. So I may have a do-it-yourself lab with five devices that are my top critical devices, right? I need to constantly have my hand on those devices, and then I may have 50 devices in a public cloud or a private cloud, to augment that approach. So I see that as a huge trend lately with a lot of companies. Again, if your budget can allow that, that's a great approach. Make sure, can't stress this enough, use data, make data-driven decisions. Do not use market data. Use your own analytics, and help that drive your test coverage, so you have you're constantly aligned with your customers and what they're using, and don't, make sure the frequency is enough. I would say weekly if you can do it. Um, Monitor all those channels, right? So use tools like Applause, or just manually scan App Store reviews, so you can find those missing scenarios and have that continuous feedback loop. Um, once things get too big, leverage tools to shift, to sift throughout all the data. And of course, we talked about the tier-based approach. So at the end of the day, we only have so many hours, so many testers. So you have to put some sanity and put a framework around it.
Yeah, I think you really have to test smartly and really think about the 80-20 rule here, Costa, more than anything else, because you just can't cover everything. It's just so many combinations.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Okay, well, we do have a question from Stephen, but I don't think we're going to be able to get to it today. The question is, effective testing is always linked to requirements. However, with a lot of mobile apps are, written on the fly with no documented requirements, and how does a tester account for this? And that's That's certainly a huge question that requires more than 2 minutes of answering. So, Stephen, we'll answer this on our blog. And any other questions that come in, you can either send a Costa or send us a question via email at services@xbosoft.com, or just ask a question on our blog. Carla?
Thanks, Phil, and thank you so much, Costa, for a really terrific presentation today. Great session. Thank you all for attending today. We will be sending you links to both the recorded version and the slideshow of today's session, so watch for that. And watch for information on our next webinar coming up October 15th on defect prevention. So have a terrific day, and thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, Costa.
Thank you.